I want to introduce Randy Brogdon, who's a member of the Institute Advisory Board. Randy is the co-practice group leader for environmental and natural resources practice group at the international law firm of Troutman and Sanders in Atlanta, Georgia. Randy is a member of our board. As I said this morning, he'll be the moderator of session 2, which focuses on the U.S. Energy challenges and opportunities. Randy.
All right, let's get started. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and so we'll get right to it. Looks like, given some time constraints, we're going to have to cut out the Harlem Shake from the end of our panel. So you're going to miss that, but we may have a follow-up DVD. Perspective is a curious thing. In talking to our panelists and other folks in the industry, on one hand, we have new extraction and exploration technologies that have really changed the paradigm for energy. When we're talking about what do we do with our surplus of natural gas and oil instead of how do we handle scarcity. And on the flip side, the adjective I hear most often when folks talk about our national energy vision and policy is incoherent. And that's probably the kindest adjective I hear on that. So when it comes to energy and the opportunities and the challenges that we're going to discuss today, that's where we're at. We have a real concern that unless we fix our energy vision, that we're going to squander the opportunities we have. So fortunately, we have a great panel here who has all given a lot of thought to these issues. And you all have extended bios for everybody here, I think except for Harry, and I'll provide some detail on you. But so I'll make these fairly succinct. We'll first start here with George. George Kaiser is president, CEO, and owner of GBK Corp., parent of Kaiser Francis Oil Company, which he has managed for over 45 years, and in various capacities and with various companies, has controlling interest in energy companies all over the world and domestically. George founded the Tulsa Community Foundation and the Tulsa Educare, and earned his Bachelor of Arts and Master's at Harvard University. Next to him is Alan Armstrong. Alan is president and CEO of Williams Companies. He's served in various roles in that at that company. Spent a lot of time in various positions, moving to the top. Alan is a member of the National Petroleum Council, the Business Roundtable, and API's Board of Directors, and earned his bachelor's degree right here at OU. Next to him is Joe Kraft. Joe is president, CEO, and director of Alliance Resources. Alliance, if you're not familiar with them, is a major diversified coal marketing and producer. So he's our coal guy. To give us a full breakdown of what our energy picture looks like. He's a member of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and U.S. Chamber of Commerce and holds bachelor's degrees and law degrees from Kentucky and also from MIT. Next to him is Mike Stice. Mike is the Chief Executive Officer of Access Midstream, formerly known as Chesapeake Midstream. And prior to that, he spent his time hopping around various locations across the globe in the exploration side of things. Mike is a member of the OU Board of Visitors for the College of Engineering, and has degrees in addition from OU, also from Stanford and George Washington. So in short, these guys know what we're talking about. And so similar to the format we had early on, I wanted just to start off with each of you. Oh, I missed Harry. Sorry, Harry. I can talk. The one I said I had to talk most about. Harry is the president and chief operating officer of Plains All-American Pipeline. Plains is the largest, or one of the largest, crude oil transportation companies in North America. So he oversees about 18,000 miles of pipeline. So when we talk about energy sources, Harry's the guy who figures out how we get it from point A to point B and make use of it. Harry graduated from the University of Oklahoma with his degree in accounting. He is a director of the American Petroleum Institute and has served as chair of their pipeline committee. So with that, we have all the pieces in place. So I wanted to start off with a quick opening statement from our panelists, and then we'll get into our panel questions. So George, if you want to start us off.
What I thought I might do is Dave Letterman's sort of introduction to the subject by way of a top 10 teaser list, which I hope will provide some of the provocative questions for other people to address with regard to oil and gas prices, and I fully expect the other panelists and the experts in the audience to challenge some of these conclusions and expand upon them to in the panel discussion and the G&A. The first top 10 list item I addressed was a pretty obvious one. North America is now self-sufficient in natural gas supplies. We import about 1% of our consumption and have significant excess capacity. The second one, North America has almost, and I deliberately select North America to cover both Canada and the United States, and to some degree New Mexico, which is a net importer. North America has almost achieved independence, which I define more or less the way Jim Woolsey did this morning, though I would require less development in order to achieve independence. North America has almost achieved independence in liquid hydrocarbon supply and may achieve self-sufficiency within 10 years. And I can explain, if it's of interest, how I define those terms later. If anyone is curious, the increase in U.S. liquids production is almost equal to the present world increase in liquids demand, thereby reducing significantly OPEC and diplomatic advantage. OPEC economic and diplomatic advantage. The third top 10 list item I identified was that the North American price of natural gas is below replacement cost and will need to rise to about $5.50 to re-stimulate large-scale drilling for dry gas. I don't believe that the price of any commodity can long remain below or well below reproduction cost, and I think the $3.50 current price is well below reproduction cost, properly calculated. 4, natural gas in North America sells for about $12 to $14 per MCF less than it does in Asia. This so-called basis differential, the difference in price of a commodity at two distinct geographic locations, will narrow in 5 to 10 years to around $7 per MCF, largely because of U.S. and Canadian LNG exports. Fifth item, world oil prices will remain range-bound in the near term between about $78 and $98 per barrel, West Texas Intermediate basis, barring a geopolitical shock on the upside or a major world recession depression on the downside. And then sixth, the new technologies that have revolutionized oil and gas reserve development in the U.S. and are not really horizontal drilling, though that's what you normally hear, or fracture treating, hydraulic fracture treating, as the lay news articles generally report. I'll leave what I see as the true transformative technologies a bit mysterious until the discussion period, in hopes that you'll wish to ask the question. Seventh, I would expect that the shale and light formation revolution, which has tight formation revolution, which has occurred in the United States, will spread to many other areas of the world and increase economic recoverable reserves of oil, gas, and natural gas liquids. In fact, it is somewhat befuddling as to why that progression has taken so long to develop to this point, which is something we could talk about. Eighth, unless and until tight and shale gas development becomes widespread and economical in Asia, as in the United States, the U.S. will recapture a small competitive advantage in manufacturing, especially in industries like chemicals, in which natural gas is a feedstock as well as a fuel, but also in industries with high fuel cost content, like in the product price, like glass, steel, autos. Some people mention aluminum, and so forth. Dow Chemical has estimated a list of 91 new manufacturing projects representing $70 billion in potential investment and up to 3 million jobs that various companies have proposed or begun because of cheap gas. The ninth, because of the concern about the surrender of this small and perhaps temporary manufacturing advantage, the political stars seem to be aligning now in the U.S. to restrict liquefied natural gas exports to about 5 to 10 billion cubic feet per day, or 38 to 78 metric tons per annum, at least until the industry can demonstrate that we can perpetuate a 100-year reserve production ratio, even with larger exports. And that will be, I'm assuming, a political control. 10th, finally, The hydrocarbon age has been extended by the new technologies to the degree that scientists and engineers should have adequate time to develop the replacement technologies that will fuel our vehicles, heat and cool our homes and offices, and produce our economic development. Now, there's no punchline intended for this top 10 list. I eliminated any source of humor. We can add that later. But it should give us simulate some ability for some interesting discussion.
Thank you, George. Can we move on then to Alan?
Sure. Well, good morning, and very thankful for the invite to be here, and a great group of speakers. And I want to say thanks to Bruce and his team for putting together such a great group, and it certainly speaks well for the University of Oklahoma, so thanks, Bruce, for your efforts. The Williams Companies is about a 105-year-old company today. We are a very large operator of energy infrastructure, and particularly focused on natural gas and natural gas products. We're one of the largest processors of natural gas, and we own the largest natural gas pipeline in the nation, the Transco pipeline, that serves most of the eastern seaboard. We also, though, manufacture from our natural gas liquids. We also are an olefins producer, and olefins are really the basic building block. About 96% of the basic chemicals that come at us on. Is that better? And about 96% of the chemicals today that are produced in the U.S. come out of both ethylene and propylene, which are the basic building blocks for chemicals. So Williams really takes it all the way from the wellhead on natural gas and distributes natural gas directly into end markets, but as well is very involved in the olefins manufacturing. And you're going to hear about that a little more today, I suspect. And as George mentioned, it's really giving us an advantage here in the U.S. on manufacturing. So we have a really unprecedented opportunity here in the U.S. We have a gift that I think is not very well understood by the American public today in terms of the great opportunity that we have. We have some of the cheapest forms of energy anywhere, and those are certainly what makes manufacturing grow here in the U.S. And so whether it is natural gas or it's coal or it's the byproducts of natural gas like ethane and propane, we have cost levels right now that are well below anywhere else in the markets around the world. And we really need a lot of infrastructure to take advantage of that. So you wonder, how could we be sitting here today with gas prices as cheap as they are, and on an equivalent basis, gas is about $20 per barrel on an equivalent basis. And you wonder, how could that exist? How could you sit here with a clean energy source that is so much lower than crude oil and what the rest of the world uses? Well, I'll tell you what, one of the very simple things about it is infrastructure. You can't carry natural gas around in a bucket. You can't carry it in a jerry can. So when you think about emerging countries, they don't start off using natural gas. It takes a lot of expensive infrastructure to be able to utilize natural gas and utilize it in both power generation and as well in manufacturing. So the U.S. is blessed today with a great set of infrastructure that allows us to move natural gas into our manufacturing facilities, convert it into chemical products, and as well continue to utilize it for power generation. So that's the good news. We've got a great opportunity in front of us. We've got a lot more. We really are just at the tip of the iceberg. There is plenty of natural gas resources and natural gas liquids resources here in the U.S. for us to continue to grow our economies off of. However, there's an emerging issue that we really need to confront as the U.S., and it is obstructionist that continues, not just, everything gets blamed on regulators, and certainly there's a lot of room for efficiency and jurisdiction, straightening out some of the jurisdictions amongst the regulators. But as well, the public is, and particularly environmental groups, are really driving a lot of that. I have a very quick anecdote that I find very interesting. We right now are laying a pipeline that runs right out of the northern part of Pennsylvania up to Iroquois, New York. It's about a 120-mile pipeline. And if you went and looked at it, you'd say, wow, this is not too bad an area to lay pipeline. It's rolling hills. not too difficult of a terrain. We also, at the same time, are laying a pipeline in 7,700 foot of water in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico, and that pipeline is about 200 miles long. The steel that you have to use in deep water is very expensive, as you can imagine, because it has to be able to withstand the external pressure, not just the internal pressure. So, and if you think laying a pipeline in deep water like that is a matter of laying it off the back of a ship, it's not quite the case. There's huge canyons, the bathymetry and the ocean floor are very difficult to lay pipeline on. But I've got a quiz for you here. The pipeline, and I'll give you a few hints, but the quiz is which one of those is more expensive to lay. So running through a rural New York and Pennsylvania, and not new technology. We've been laying pipelines for a long time. It's cheaper and cheaper to actually construct the pipeline. The pipeline cost, I'll give you a hint, is about $660,000 per mile for the steel, and in the deep water, it's about $950,000 per mile for the steel. The cost, however, to lay pipeline onshore is about $4.8 million per mile now in that area. The cost to lay in the deep water, and by the way, 10 years ago, we didn't even think it was feasible to be able to lay pipeline in that depth of water. The cost there is $1.7 million per mile, 2.4 times more expensive to lay pipeline in 7,700 foot of water. And what do you think the primary difference is there? The primary difference is that we have one regulator in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico, very strict, very clear on the rules, and we build to very, very high standards and quality there. In the Northeast, we have about 33 different regulators, many of which are regulating on the same thing between local, state, and federal. So it's not a matter of difficult regulation. It's a matter of just give us a rule that we can actually live by. Many of the rules that they come up with are actually mutually exclusive. In other words, you can't do it the way the Corps of Engineers requires you to do it and the way the State Department of Environmental Protection requires. They literally cannot do it both ways. And so those are the things that we're facing. But again, I don't think it's fair to blame that all on the regulators, because a lot of that is response to the public trying to stop the production of natural gas. And so you've heard a lot about hydraulic fracturing. You've heard a lot of resistance to hydraulic fracturing. That's pretty hard to stop because a lot of it's on private lands. It's one spot at a time. But what's not so hard to stop and what has a lot of handles on it is laying infrastructure and laying pipelines. And so we are on the verge of really adding dramatically to the cost and our ability to use this very low-cost resource that we have as a country and to drive jobs and to drive our economy if we continue to let individuals become obstructionists for us to be able to lay the infrastructure that it takes to be able to utilize this great resource. So good news is great opportunity in front of us. And I will just tell you, we have got to get loud and clear about standing and not allowing for the obstructionists, for us to be able to grow our economy and grow our jobs here in the U.S. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion with the team here.
Very good. Welcome to my world.
You got some people like that too.
Yeah. Randy, thank you.
Thank you, Joe,
for the introduction, and thank OU for inviting me. Having a coal guy, if you track GDP growth, there is a direct correlation with coal-fired electricity growth over the last 40 years, almost directly. So you are entering into an industry that is an honorable industry. It is what that I think is probably the greatest contributor to mankind. You see the growth in our economy. If you look at the life expectancy today, if you look at the air, you look at the water that we have today, it's better than ever before. And what we see is the need. The greatest thing about coal that I think about is electricity, because that's the primary use for coal, and people love electricity. And as we see it with your iPhones and your form of communication today, We can't live without it, as we saw with the Super Bowl as well. At the company that I work for, it's a small coal company, relatively speaking. We're the third largest coal producer in the eastern United States, all underground mining. We produced in 2012 around 34 million tons. We're going to grow to about 44 million tons by next year, hopefully by the end of next year. So we continue to grow. We've been a public company since 1999, and we've had a record performance in operating and financial results over that 12-year period. We expect that to continue for the next 2 to 3. As we look at our size and relative and put it in perspective to the entire coal industry in the United States, the coal industry today produces around 1 billion tons in the United States. About 82% of that goes to domestic utilities. We've got another 5% that goes to international utilities, and the balance is used for steel making, both domestically and abroad. When we look at coal, and you hear a lot of what was discussed earlier today about the decline, you read about it with headlines, the facts are coal has been the fastest fuel used in the world over the last 10 years. It's projected to be the fastest fuel to be used in the world over the next 10 years. It's driven primarily by China. If you look at China, China today consumes right at 4 billion tons, 4 times what America consumes. In the 1990s, they were at 1 billion tons, similar to where we are today. Over that time period, they've grown and they've relied on coal-fired electricity to lift their people from poverty. We have seen over 1 billion people have electricity over the last 20 years because of coal-fired electricity. Today, China consumes, as I mentioned, the 4 billion tons. That's 70% of their electricity generation is coal-fired. They're expected between now and 2016 to add another 1 billion tons of coal consumption in their country. India, likewise, is relying on coal. They have 65% of their their electricity generation generated by coal. They're going to grow to 80% over the next decade. So what we see in the world economy is a growth on coal, primarily because of the cost advantage that George mentioned. So when you look at coal and compared to gas in Asia, you got gas in the $15 to $20 million BTU range in Asia versus the low-cost position that coal brings to the equation. As we come back to the U.S., one of the strengths that we have in the U.S. is the fact that we do have 1/3 of all coal reserves in the world. So we have what the world wants. However, in the U.S., because of primarily natural gas in part, but more importantly, I think, for our discussion today is government policy. We are seeing our demand erode. So over the last 4 years, we've seen coal demand from electric utilities decline by 200 million tons. So we're roughly around 825 million tons. We see that with the natural gas prices starting to show some increase, that coal will begin to recover some of the markets they've lost. Most people are predicting this year that we will see probably 30 to 50 million tons more coal demand in 2013 than we had in 2012. I hope George is right on his $5.50 per million BTU gas prediction. If that's the case, then we're going to see coal go back to the billion-ton level that it was prior to 2008. I'm not counting on that. I'm counting on a coal demand to be around the 800 to 900 million ton level, but it is stabilized, and we are going to be here for some time. We have to be because of the size and the scale of this world in the United States and the energy demand that we need to be able to have the economy and the cost of living, standard of living that we expect. So as I look at the challenges and the opportunities, we are blessed in this country. The opportunities, for the first time and for many years, we have an abundance of oil, natural gas, and coal in this country, all low cost. This economy's been built on low-cost energy policy, and we have that today more so than we've ever had in my career. Second thing is we've got the ability with the number one challenge we have with the debt in D.C. as well as the jobs. We've got an economic stimulus by private investment in the energy space. We've seen that. If you think the economy is bad, just think what it would have been had it not been for the shale plays the last 4 years, of what the economic impact of low-cost energy has brought to the United States. We have been a world economic leader globally. We need to keep that. We see China and India trying to emulate what we have done. They're trying to lift their people from poverty. They're trying to urbanize. They're trying to improve the quality of life and standard of living for their people by depending on a low-cost energy strategy. They're copying what we have done. We need to go back to that policy and retain that for future generations. And finally, I think diversity has served us well. I'm more than happy to compete in the marketplace. We need free markets. Again, that's another element that's allowed us to have the economic standing that we have today. You know, we need free markets, but we also need diversity so we can have stability in price and opportunity. On the challenge side, I think the challenges that I see is that the people in the government they take energy for granted. They think they can do anything and that we will still be there, we will still be low cost, we will still have the opportunities for the quality of life that we've been able to provide up to this moment in time, no matter what they do. Nothing is further from the truth. You got to pay attention to fundamentals, and you got to nurture the elements that get the results that we've been able to achieve over these many years. I think secondly, we heard General Clark talk about we don't want to make this partisan, and I wish that was the case. The unfortunate part is that politics has entered the energy industry with a vengeance. Alan talked about it. We are experiencing, you know, when we went public in 1999, the first, one of the questions was, what's the one thing that keeps you up at night? At that time, I said, Al Gore getting elected president. Fortunately, it was delayed about 10 years, but today, for the first time, I think that where my career has been all driven by economics, I've had to deal with politics. It's not what I want to do, but it's what I've had to do because of the obstructionists that Alan mentioned. And finally, I think our challenge is education and communication and how we educate the people to not take for granted, to focus on what it takes for us to be successful, to have a free economy, a growing economy, and to be able to continue to contribute to mankind to provide the quality of life and standard of living that we all want to have. We're all need to be partners in that, and I welcome this opportunity to try to foster that education process so we can reach that goal.
Thanks, Joe. Let's move over to Mike.
Thanks, appreciate it. Joe's a brave man, coming here between two gas guys. We do have a role for you, it's just a little one. I want to thank Randy, thank Bruce, thank the University of Oklahoma for having us here. Obviously, it's a good conversation to be having. A lot of distinguished speakers here. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them. But I am here to kind of share with you some of my relevant experiences. George, you did us a gift by giving us some of your thoughts on the top 10. I'm going to kind of move away from any prepared remarks because Alan made most of the ones that I was going to make. But when I think about the title of our session, Challenges and Opportunities, I can't help but be overwhelmed and, as you said, feeling blessed about the opportunity that we have in front of us here in North America. Everyone here has probably read Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize. And the theme of that is without exception, history has repeated itself, where the energy industry has been the stimulus for economic growth, for great things to happen. And it doesn't matter how far back you go. I think what Yergin had the benefit of is writing a history book. He was looking backward and seeing where the opportunities presented themselves. We're actually living it today. I'm anxious to see what they write about this era that we're in right now, because this is an exciting time to be in the energy industry. I appreciate the plug for the students that are here, and this is an incredible industry full of incredible people. And don't read everything, or don't believe everything you read about the energy industry, because unfortunately some of the public criticisms are just not true. Having been in the industry 33 years, I've had some ups and downs in my experience, and I think it's important to be transparent about that. I'll be really direct. In 2003, I was in charge of the supply committee of the National Petroleum Council. If you haven't read the 2003 National Petroleum Council letter to the president, it read something like, natural gas is gone, it's over, put a fork in it. There's not any opportunity for natural gas in North America again. Everybody needs to go overseas where the natural gas is, otherwise we're going to run out of natural gas. And I believed it so much that I changed my whole career. I literally packed up my family, moved to the Middle East, and was responsible for building one of the LNG trains there in Qatar. Before we got the train built, before that 8 million tons per annum was built, 77 million tons per annum in Qatar in total, that's a lot of gas, by the way, we had sold it all to China, and not one drop of it came to the United States. That's even after we built a regasification facility in Golden Pass here in the Gulf Coast. So within the 5 years that I had this picture, the whole world changed. And that's when Aubrey gave me a call and said, Mike, you need to come back. You're a gas guy. And you need to come back to North America where the gas business is. And he was so true. And so the reason I share the study, the National Petroleum Council study of 2003, that was only a decade ago. And so it makes you wonder, what did we miss? What was it that we, all of us, and there was a lot of prestigious people on that council, how did we miss so badly? And it's to George's point. We underestimated the role of technology. We underestimated the role of entrepreneurism in North America. And a group of very hungry, very aggressive independents took technology, applied it to the resource itself, and we have the shale revolution that you and I have experienced here today. It's an incredible story. Obviously, I packed up my bags, immediately came back to North America, and have loved it ever since. But we are at a very exciting juncture within the development of the natural gas business. We are in an oversupplied situation. I agree with George that 550 is a better number than 325. I also believe that we have to have LNG exports. We do need to be careful about that opportunity, however. Too many people are advocating LNG exports, or they're advocating energy independence or energy self-sufficiency with the understanding that we can become protectionist in our policies. We can become isolated. I can't tell you enough how a big a mistake I believe that would be. Having come from the global part of the world and sold gas to China and worked in Singapore, worked in Australia, I can tell you that we need to be a part of the global economy, not separated from it. So I'm excited about what LNG exports will mean to having natural gas as a global commodity. I'm excited about competing in that global world. I'm not somebody that wants to restrict trade across our borders. And so I think it's important that we embrace that. To the point that George raised around why is shale not being developed overseas as quickly. I had a brief 5-year trial in my career where San Juan coals were unbelievable. Coal bed methane in Black Warrior Basin. We were doing some things for Consol in the coal business. And we thought, gosh, there ought to be coal bed methane everywhere. And so I spent 5 years going all across the world looking for how you could stimulate these global coals and bring this natural gas. And what I learned was a lot of what Bob talked about earlier in Russia. We are blessed here in North America with a tremendous context, a tremendous infrastructure, services, businesses. It is not as easy as it might seem as it is here in North America. Now, it takes time, but they will ultimately be able to globalize what we've experienced here in North America on shale. It took us over 15 years to see the Australian coals get developed, and they're now in the form of LNG projects. But I will tell you the challenge of taking what we believe is easy or we've been blessed with from the underground geological standpoint is not as easily executed overseas. And so it doesn't surprise me, George, that it's taking a while, just because I saw how hard it was when I tried to do it myself. We haven't talked enough about the environmental benefits. I'm a huge advocate of natural gas, largely because I see the environmental benefits, 25% reduction in greenhouse gases, sorry, Joe. Reductions in particulates. I think it's an important part of our overall equation, but I believe that diversity is the strength. We should have a diversity of energy sources. We should have all of it, and we should create the optionality that consumers need. I love the conversation General Clark was talking about with regard to giving consumers options. One of those options, General Clark, should be natural gas. So the CNG aspect. I drove down here in a CNG vehicle. I paid 99 cents a gallon. I don't know what you paid for your gasoline, but my guess is you took more than $15 to fill up your truck. And so I'm a very big advocate of the transportation sector. We have 69 BCF a day of natural gas demand here in North America. If you converted the entire transportation fleet in North America, that'd be another 74 BCF a day of demand. I'm not asking that it be 74, but there should be 5–10% of that should be converted to natural gas. We didn't talk enough about jobs. I'm very excited about the stimulus that our business has on jobs. There's been a number of case studies in the Barnett. The Perryman Group had the benefit of looking back over 10 years, and we produced almost 596,000 jobs, person years, over that 10 years. We stimulated the economy $80 billion. That's one sequester, okay? So this industry is actually doing an outstanding job of employing people, and it's not just jobs. In the four-county area of West Virginia where the Marcellus is, not only did jobs go up in that four-county area by 31%, the quality of jobs, the average wage went up 45%. So these are good-paying, quality jobs, and it's exciting to see what it does to our overall economy. So I think in balance, what I would just say in closing is the opportunities far outweigh the challenges, but the challenges are there. The regulatory environment that Alan talked about that he's experienced in Pennsylvania, I have just as many anecdotal stories. Some of them are almost laughable, where one agency will tell you to do it one way and the other agency comes right behind you and says you got to do it in a different way. And then refuse to get together in one room to tell you which way is best, okay? So it's that type of what I call chaos that we're going to have to deal with it. But those of you in this room, this is an exciting time. There will be a great chapter written. I don't know if you're going to write it, but someone will write it about what we're living in right now today. You should be thrilled to have the blessings that we have as far as the North American geology, but also be thrilled to be a part of this industry because this industry is going to make a big difference, not only in its own footprint, but within the economies, both nationally and globally.
Thanks, Mike. Harry, why don't you tell us what's going on from the pipeline sector point of view?
I'll try. So once again, I'll echo everyone's comments, thanking Bruce for putting this symposium on and University of Oklahoma. It's really fun being a part of it. Mike, you weren't the only one that left the U.S. I think all the majors left with you.
Yep.
They packed up their bags, went overseas looking for oil and gas reserves, and it's really changed the dynamics of this country. If you think about it, 15 years ago, Plains All America didn't own any pipes. Today we own 18,000 miles of pipe. Well, the same goes for for the production in the U.S. A lot of the majors controlled all the production in the U.S. They sold it to independents. The independents seized on the opportunity, used technology, and have really advanced production in the United States. Same story with refineries. It's really interesting if you can look and see what's gone on over the last several years. Since 2008, we've increased U.S. oil production by 2 million barrels a day, from about 5 million barrels a day to 7 million barrels a day. We've increased natural gas production by 10 BCF. We've increased NGL production by a third, up to 2.6 million barrels a day. And what that's done, in addition to creating jobs, it's changed the balance of payments. It's cut our imports significantly. We're an exporter of refined products. In 2008, we're probably balanced as slightly importers of refined products. Today, we export 2 million barrels a day. You think about that in terms of maybe $150, $200 billion a year change in the balance of payments, pretty significant impact on the country. It's also created a lot of challenges and a lot of growth opportunities. This whole pipeline infrastructure really was developed to move crude from coastal regions into the interior of the U.S., and all that's reversed. All these significant shale plays are in the interior of the U.S. It's created lots of opportunities for infrastructure players like like Plains and these guys as well. So what's happened over the last few years, we're in an unprecedented environment. It's kind of like 1950s in a way, where all these new fields are being developed. You need infrastructure to move crude and refined products to markets. You've seen pipelines reversing flow, like Seaway Pipeline. You've seen pipelines changing service, like Trunkline, gas pipeline, and you see a lot of infrastructure demands. So one of the several challenges are associated with the growth that's required to develop the infrastructure necessary to move our oil and gas to the right markets. First, it's just shortage of labor. The industry has been consolidating for years and years and years, and everybody's got a huge gap in their labor force. A lot of young people, a lot of older people, like this group, and but not a lot of people. Not a lot of people in the middle. A real shortage of skilled laborers, electricians, welders, instrumentation techs. It's making it hard to develop the infrastructure that's necessary. I think everyone's touched on regulatory. I think everyone has their own regulatory stories, but there have been a lot of regulations developed at a lot of different levels, and it does complicate the timeliness in which production can be moved to market and developed and moved to market. And then the other thing that's really happened is a lot of the new oil production lease has been light in nature. And a lot of the refineries over the last 10 years have really been reconfigured to run heavy crudes. They figured they were going to have to import heavy crudes from the Middle East, other parts of the world, and the shale is all light oil, and these refineries aren't configured. So another issue we have from an infrastructure standpoint is how do you get the product to the right markets, and how do you make the most efficient use of our refineries? So our refineries are advantaged in two ways. One, they've got low-cost natural gas, which is very competitive on a worldwide basis. And secondly, they've got probably the cheapest source of crude in the world. But what they're struggling with is getting the necessary permits to reconfigure the refineries, to expand the refineries, and really be able to export refined products. So those are some of the challenges that I see that the industry is facing, has been facing, and will face over the next few years. So that's sort of the comments that I had for this part. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Go ahead, George.
Harry, it might be in a visit among ourselves. If I understand correctly, you operate pipelines and terminals in the Cushing area and elsewhere.
Yes.
Let me ask you two questions. The State Department recently reported that there weren't any insuperable barriers to approval of the northern portion of the Keystone XL pipeline. What do you think is in the best national interest? Will it be recommended by the State Department, approved by the federal government, and is it in the best national interest of U.S. pipeliners or producers? And then secondly, a related question, what do you expect the differential between Brent crude pricing and WT, West Texas Intermediate crude pricing, to be over the next 2 or 3 years?
Sure. On Keystone, it's really kind of, in a way, it's a competitor to us, but I just can't believe that it isn't in the best interest of the country to have the pipeline approved. You've got tremendous resource base in Canada. The crude naturally wants to flow into the U.S. You've got refineries that want that type of crude, and it just makes eminent sense to have the Keystone Pipeline approved. I'm very hopeful that it gets approved. The Association of Oil Pipelines, the API, have all been supportive of it. It seems like it should be a natural to have it approved. I'd be stunned if it wasn't, but there are a lot of other factors that are being considered for the approval of it. On WTI Brent, boy, it's a great question. 18 months ago, I would have said that the differentials would have been compressed. You've got declining North Sea crude, got increasing domestic crude. You're not allowed to export crude oil except for ANS. So I think in the long term, there's going to be a differential. It's probably going to be sort of the displacement transportation differential, maybe in the $5 or $6 range. But I think, you've got, I think you just got demand in the Far East. It's going to take Brent and West African crude that way, keep the U.S. produced crude in this hemisphere, but I think there'll be a $5 to $10 differential.
Do you think the scarcity of railroad cars has allowed the relatively limited number of railroad companies to charge well above their out-of-pocket cost for transportation and kept that differential higher?
Well, rail cars are a premium, that's for sure. Yeah, I think it has had an impact on, the price of crude. Now, the rails in general, they've seen a tremendous decline in utilization from coal. Crude oil has probably made up 30 or 40% of that loss, so it's been a significant benefit. It's probably, BNSF probably has been the biggest winner of the rails. Canadian Pacific probably second. But I think rail's going to be part of the permanent solution. If you can look at the Bakken, I don't think you're going to build a new pipeline into the Philadelphia area. I don't think you're going to build a new pipeline into California. I think rail is going to be part of the solution for areas of the country.
$6, 2 years.
Brent WTI, 6, 7, yes.
We've had a couple of mentions of diversity and just sort of passing reference that people believe in diversity of fuel sources, make the case for why diversity is important. And I think the secondary question is how you to determine that mix of diverse energy sources. And Alan, we'll start with you on that one, but anybody else can chime in on why diversity is important. Make that case.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think the most important thing we should remember is that we don't really need the government dictating what the best source is. And so while I hear Joe talking about diversity, and I don't disagree that you want the competitive forces working to keep that diversity in balance, I think mandating that is just as big a mistake as it is to subsidize uneconomic sources of energy. And so, there was a lot of discussion here a couple of years ago about, even as recent as last year, about subsidizing natural gas and mandating use of natural gas. And frankly, I don't think that's sound policy. On the other hand, we also shouldn't be mandating and providing huge subsidies to wind or solar or any other form of energy. We certainly in the government's place to reduce barriers that allows those products to come into market and those services to come into market. But they certainly, I don't think the government should be in any position to be picking fuels. And so that diversity, I think, naturally will happen by itself as long as you get the rules out of the way. So that's my thoughts. But I am supportive of research dollars on being spent on overcome some of the initial barriers that it takes to get alternate forms of energies introduced into the market.
Great. Joe, do you have anything to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm not mandating, I'm not suggesting that we should mandate diversity. I think it should occur by the marketplace. I think that our policies today really are limiting our only choice for electric utility generation to gas because the alternative sources are just going to be a niche play. They're not going to be able to compete on cost and scale to provide electricity generation. So we are, as a country, if we try to dial coal out of the equation, because the other base load fuel source you got is nuclear, and unfortunately we don't see many nuclear plants being built either. So I think that we are pretty much ending up with a one fuel source policy. And like anything, I think having a diversification of a portfolio is going to give you more security. And we, as Mike talked about, in 2003 trying to judge where natural gas was going to be. It's very difficult to determine and to put all your eggs in one basket. And diversification, I think, serves us well, and we've got the scale and we've got the quantity, the reserves to do that. And technology can provide some of the solution on the environmental issue, which is really the only issue that would argue against it. And as we see the benefits of low-cost energy, I think we need to continue to focus on that and to continue to drive towards technological solutions as opposed to prohibitions of use of one fuel or the other.
I know the equilibrium price between coal and gas is different in different places, obviously. But do you have a generalized rule of thumb that you would establish for the point at which coal can effectively compete with natural gas, what price it can compete with natural gas?
If you look at there's 4 regions that are primarily coal-producing regions in the United States. You've got the Powder River Basin, Illinois Basin, Northern Appalachia, Central Appalachia. In the Powder River Basin, it's heavily dependent on the railroads that you mentioned on the crude side. So the railroads can determine what they want that to be. At current rail rates, I would say $2.50 is sort of the break-even point for most PRB producers. You go to the extreme to Central Appalachia, which is our highest cost region, which, by the way, under the Obama administration, costs have gone up 40% in Central Appalachia. So 4 years ago, that answer would have been $4. Today, it's probably $4.50 to $5 for Central Appalachia. In the Illinois Basin, where we are, that price would range anywhere from $3 to $3.50. Northern App's about the same amount.
Okay. Well, we're seeing a significant movement around the $3.50 area. Maybe as much as half the gas seems to be uneconomical around that area. I don't know if that ties with the
So that's
proportions.
back to PRB, so they're grabbing most of that market share back. But Illinois Basin will probably pick up 9 to 10 million tons this year.
Okay. And maybe we should then address what is the equilibrium price for gas. At least it's my theory the equilibrium price for gas has been held back by excess drilling. But the average well in the United States drilled for gas, dry gas, over the last 2 years has been uneconomic. Not true of Marcellus in some areas. And that the true price of gas necessary to generate an adequate rate of return is somewhere in the $5 to $5.50 range. Might pause and see if Mike and Alan and others disagree with that or agree with that. And
Well, I think much as Joe was mentioning, it's certainly different in different parts of the country. And one of the important things from an infrastructure provider's point of view is to make sure that you're investing in the infrastructure that's the low-cost area, because you're going to be there for a long time when you go to make the pipeline or the processing plant investment. And so very critical to get that right in terms of where the low-cost locations are. One of the big drivers, as you know, George, is the associated products that come with that, whether it's natural gas liquids or whether it's condensate or whether it's actually crude oil, and the gases are just associated with crude oil production. And that is driving a tremendous amount of the continued follow-on of natural gas today. But I also have been trying to draw people's attention to the fact that just because we've lowered rig count down to where we have today, dramatic continued reduction in rig count that are drilling for natural gas versus what we saw a year ago. And people are saying, well, geez, these rigs must just be incredibly efficient because we're still continuing to hold even on production. And a couple of things that I'll tell you that are driving that. One, no producer likes to say they're drilling for natural gas. So if they have the alternative of checking the box if we're drilling for liquids or drilling for gas, they're going to check the liquids box these days. And so, and obviously in places like the Utica and the Marcellus, the gas is wet and there's enough condensate that that's a justifiable decision. But yet there's still a lot of gas coming with that investment. Secondly, and I think very, very important in the immediate term, is that there is a tremendous amount of gas still waiting on infrastructure to be installed to carry the gas. So even though we may have shut down the drilling, the gas continues to come on as we continue to get all those wells connected. Eventually, we're going to see the other side of that. Eventually, we're going to catch up. The infrastructure side will catch up with that, and we'll start to see a more dramatic decline that's more relative to the 420 rigs that we have drilling for dry natural gas. And so I think you have to be very careful about the numbers that you're paying attention to and not taking it too broad a level. You really have to look underneath that broad level and look to how many wells are actually coming online in the time frame, and that number is still much higher than the number of rigs running just because of the infrastructure. And what I mean by infrastructure is the pipelines that go connect those wells, the processing plants that have to be in place to be able to process that gas and sometimes treat that gas to make it ready to come into our natural gas grid around the nation.
I agree with most of what you said, Alan. I do think we have we certainly had efficiencies in the oil and gas industry. We were drilling wells much faster. We're treating them more effectively. We need fewer rigs to generate the same amount of supply. I also agree that producers are describing wells, particularly in the Mississippian, as gas wells when they're in fact oil wells and in other areas. And part of that all plays a part. Having said that, though, we have in fact reduced the apparent deliverability of natural gas by about 5.5 million barrels a day from the trend line that it was on before. In other words, we had 5.5 billion extra a year ago. We flattened out over the last year, and demand has kept going up. It's the first time we flattened out for some period of time, so we are reaching a little bit diminishing returns. It seems to me that the so-called drilled but uncompleted wells, the acronym being DUCs, right, in the Marcellus are pretty well gone and went faster than people expected. We have extraordinary drilled but uncompleted wells in the Marcellus, perhaps as many as have already been drilled. To me, the variable that makes a big difference, and beyond that reflects excess capacity that will hold the price of of gas down, is that we've gone 5 years without stressing the system. And so there are a lot of things we haven't done during this 5 years that will allow additional gas to be derived from the system. It's little things like compression in the transmission system, a few pounds, 25 pounds is probably 1 billion cubic feet per day in the entire system throughout the United States. Compression in the gathering system, compression at the wellhead. And we've deferred all of that because gas was cheap, there was no acceleration, did not pay you anything. We've deferred recompletions, we've deferred completions, we've deferred connections, so that there will be a time, even when we reach a tighter supply-demand relationship, which I think we're reaching as we speak, that we'll have another extended period of time when there will be excess gas available. And whether that will hold the price down below equilibrium levels further, probably will. But I don't see how in the long run gas can be produced for less than reproduction cost. And to me, I'd like at least to make or argue the point that reproduction cost is somewhere in the range of $5.50 realization. $3 typical finding cost yielding about a $5.50 per MCF realization. And if that's the case, it would seem to me it redeems coal in all the 4 areas you talked about for an extended period of time if we can get there. Or does coal just rise to meet the gas price?
I mean, there will be efforts, again, on the cost side to raise our costs like there have been over the last 4 years. But I tend to agree with your analysis personally. I mean, that's why I continue to invest in it. We've invested $500 million over the last 3 years. We got 2 new operations coming online in 14 and 15. And we're continuing to look to continue with our strategy of trying to increase production 10% a year and make sure we got reserves for 20-year life. So we're acquiring reserves, we're continuing to invest in coal mines, and we believe that the industry is, it will bottom out at 800 million to 900 million ton range for domestic utilities. And I didn't mention that in 2012, with the growth in coal internationally, we did set a record for exports, and we're seeing a lot of additional capacity being added at the ports to also see if we can increase the exports of coal in the United States.
Mike, one of the, I think, untold stories when we talk about the energy market now is that the jobs issue that you mentioned. There's sort of a passing reference of all the jobs that you all have collectively created in the nation. It doesn't seem to be a story that's getting out there. Talk a little bit about job creation in the energy sector, and what do you consider to be the biggest impediment to even increasing employment opportunities for Americans?
Right. So I think what I've always found exciting about being part of this industry is that when you go into a development, I was recently touring the Eagleford, and every time you go into one of these shale plays where all the excitement, the hotels are full, the restaurants are full, the truck traffic is, multiple times what people have ever seen there before. The enthusiasm, it literally feels like a boom. And I don't know I wasn't around when the gold rush was like, but in many regards, I'm certain this has some aspects of it. You can see the stimulus in the economy. You can see the excitement that the local folks, some find the change difficult, to be frank. Others find the change, obviously, a gift. And when we look at the specific anecdotal stories and the impact that we're having on these communities, it's nothing less than heartening. I mean, you can almost fly the flag and listen to the national anthem as we're walking through some of these communities. And some of the stories that we hear about people who were basically in an economy that was struggling, that unemployment was overbearing on them. I especially like this study that workforce.com did around the 4-county area in West Virginia, because this was an area that was really struggling. I mean, people wanted to stay there, they wanted to live there, and there were no jobs. And to see them not only get employment, not just direct employment, but the indirect impact. But to see them get employment, not on just any job, but a job that paid them 41% more than they made, the year before. And so it's very exciting to see the impact that we have. The Perriman Group study in the Barnett is probably the most comprehensive, and it looked at just the impact to the area in the metropolitan Fort Worth Barnett shale footprint, and that was a $65 billion kind of impact. Then they looked at the Texas total. That was like an $85 billion impact. These are huge implications to local economies, and it's exciting. It's also exciting for universities, because we're now coming to the university looking for qualified, educated students that can come and play significant and material roles as we develop out these resources. And so it's exciting for our educators, it's exciting for the young people that are entering the workforce today, it's exciting for the economies in which we're working. I mean, we talk about the Perriman Group and the study in the Barnett, that's only one of a dozen shale plays like that. So this is going on all over the country. And as I mentioned before, in 2003, none of us saw it coming. That's why I think it's really important that we get to George Kaiser's list of what the next technologies are, because frankly, that's what we missed. We missed the implication. Going back to George's question, what is the gas price threshold? Frankly, I find that a very difficult question to answer for the variables that Alan raised. There's liquid-rich implications. There's regional basis implications. You can be in the Appalachia and the gas price is very different because you're too close to the city gate. There's whether or not it's pure dry gas with high flow deliverabilities in the first year, like in the Haynesville, or whether it's a Barnett well where you're looking at 3.2 BCF EUR flatline for 30 years. Okay, there's so many variables to be able to answer the question, what is that threshold? There's a demand implication. The demand implication is if you told me I was targeting 68 BCF, then I might say it's 450, okay? If you told me it was going to be 80 BCF, then I might say it may be 550, like the number that you talked about, because there is a correlation between the price and the reserves that we can actually access. So good news on the job story, everybody. If you're here getting an education in the right disciplines that can come to work for the energy industry and be part of a pretty exciting picture, you got a lot to look forward to. And then back to George's question, I think that number is a variable, and you really have to dig deep to get the exact number that you're looking for.
Randy, one of the things that the Association of Oil Pipelines has been looking at is trying to go to some of these universities and get a little more energy training in the schools, particularly with engineers, a little more about pipelines and hydraulics and things that are a little more energy specific, so that they can come out and students can come out and contribute more on hit the ground running. And then obviously intern programs help, and I think you see a lot of companies coming to universities and implementing intern programs that 5 years ago companies weren't as aggressive at doing that. So I think that's some of the things that can help spur job growth.
Are we eliminating geology and encouraging engineering and geophysics?
Are we eliminating geology?
Geology.
It seems like it. I'm not in that segment of the business, but it does feel like it. What do you think, George?
How many of you are majoring in geology?
That many. Oh, we've got one.
Are you embarrassed to say so? Or?
Don't want to-
Since I was on the board of visitors of College Earth and Energy, I have to say a plug. We still need geology. We need to understand that source rock. There has been an influence to the plumbing, if you will, the production engineering aspect of it, but geologists play a key role in taking whatever shale we're presented with and turning it into something that we can, actively, economically produce. This is a science-based industry, and so don't fool yourself. We need every bit of those technologies and that expertise.
Back on one of the other businesses which hasn't generated a lot of employment that you've been in, LNG business, we haven't talked about it. Are we going to be exporting 5 to 8 BCF a day from the U.S. by 2020? Do we have a 100-year supply irrespective of the growth of chemical company manufacturing in the United States and export? Will the Far East decouple from oil and pay less for natural gas?
Man, that's a lot of questions, George.
I think he was just going to say yes.
But I think the answer is yes. Okay, so the reality of it is, I feel very strongly that we should be exporting LNG, and we should be doing the 5 to 8 BCF a day by 2020. I think the 21 BCF a day of projects that are currently being considered, that's a ridiculous number, and we shouldn't. People don't realize that the entire LNG global market is only 66 BCF a day. And North America has got a great success story here, but the concept of us going and doing a third of the entire market at today's terms doesn't make any sense. There's no doubt you can sell gas into Asia for $16 a million BTU. You can sell gas into Europe for $10 a million BTU, and you can buy it here in the U.S. for $3.25. Doesn't take a rocket science to figure out how that works, and so we can make the ship and put that LNG in large tankers. And now George obviously knows that business really well with his Accelerate experience. But the tankers are so large now that the incremental cost to get to these locations is well within the money. So we're going to see LNG exports. I hope we don't see government regulation that even restricts it. I hope that it's a free-flowing, let the market decide. And I believe that global competition for natural gas is the right way to go. Even if that's the case, the bilateral negotiations globally for LNG are long-term, 10, 15, 20-year contracts. It will still take time before a healthy global spot market for LNG develops. But we will see, in my opinion, I kind of feel like the Keystone Pipeline. The only thing that should stop LNG export is some kind of political insanity. And not to say that political insanity couldn't happen. I'm just saying that that was what it would take.
You can reconcile somewhat the concerns about the edge that America is gaining in manufacturing cost through low-cost gas and the desire to export gas and get our balance of payments benefit and just financial benefit, because fortunately, even though the cost of gas in the United States right now is around 3.5, probably going, I think, to 5 or 5.5 over the next several years. Beyond that, you have at least $3.50 to secure and liquefy the gas per MCF. Then you can't take the largest tankers because only tankers up to 173,000 cubic meters will go through the Panama Canal. So your cost to transport is about another $2.50 to the Far East. So you have inevitably, plus you have regasification in the Far East, so you have inevitably probably about a $7 differential between the cost at a manufacturing plant in the Gulf Coast and the cost of a manufacturing plant in Japan or China. So we will, even with export, preserve our manufacturing advantage, the vast majority of it.
And I think a point that Ed Morse made this morning, which I thought was spot on, is that it's odd from my perspective, since we're in the processing business and the front end of the petrochemical business, it's odd from my perspective why we think limiting the expansion of natural gas production in the overall market here in the U.S. is a bad thing for the petrochemical business, because the more gas we're developing for LNG, the more NGLs or natural gas liquids are coming with that, and that really is the advantage that the petrochemicals have here. And so from a chemical base, not necessarily speaking to fertilizer and speaking to steel manufacturing, but to the petrochemicals business, it is a huge positive if we're continuing to develop more and more natural gas resources for LNG, because a lot of natural gas liquids are going to come with that. I would also say, though, one of the things that really took gas prices down here last year and took it to levels people didn't really expect was a very warm winter here in the U.S. We didn't have a warm winter in the rest of the world. We had in the Northern Hemisphere, we had it here in the U.S. If natural gas in the U.S. would have been exposed to those broad markets, we would have seen not this dip that we've got in natural gas drilling right now. We'd been seen very steady. So my answer to George's question around 2020 LNG export and so forth, if we actually see $5.50 gas price, all of those things will occur. If we continue to limit our markets and don't go after that, then I think we could see quite a bit of volatility imposed.
There are two big questions we haven't dealt with here if we want to. One of them is hydraulic fracturing, or at least what's claimed to be the issue of hydraulic fracturing, which is misstated. And the other is, nobody had talked in the earlier panel about electric cars. They talked about methanol, ethanol, and all liquid cars. Nobody talked about electric cars. Do we want to deal with either of those?
Tom Fanning would probably be the best one to address that in session 3.
I'm sure he'll have an opinion on that. I guess with regard to logistics, George, that certainly could be a question we could field from the audience. As we did on session 1, I want to make sure we have a few minutes. We're now going to adjust lunch to 12:40. We're going to take a couple of minutes, but we know we're between you and your lunch. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience, and I think that's a great question to field. And so if you guys have the mics. I think we've got one there.
Yeah, I have a question. When I read things like this article in National Geographic, one of the things I've noticed over in talking to people is I think we need to get a model more like Texas as far as the distribution of the resources of natural resource development. In Texas, I think the landowner retains 10% of the revenue that's generated off of that land, and the rest of it, 90%, could be, of course, bought and sold amongst the corporate and other entities. In Oklahoma and North Dakota and many other states, the reason that you have so much animosity in amongst the people is that they have nothing, because those mineral rights were bought up 50 years ago, 80 years ago, and so then the corporations come in.
And I think most of you know that minerals are leased in an arrangement under which the mineral owner or the surface owner owns somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of all of the hydrocarbons withdrawn from that land, free and clear of all cost, to render the oil or gas marketable at the wellhead. There's no question that people came through in the 20s and 30s and 40s and on and acquired mineral rights from surface owners, and that occurred in Oklahoma. It occurred in Texas. In Texas, you had many larger ranches which held on to their mineral rights, but didn't mean that the general populace owned interests. I don't think the difference between a landowner ownership of minerals in Oklahoma and Texas is materially different. That's anecdotal. I don't have a study that I can point to, but we've operated in both states for many, many years. I do think what has happened in the reverse is that Oklahoma has a statute which is more favorable, in fact, unduly favorable toward the producer in allowing the producer to develop the hydrocarbons. Because if you have even a very small fractional interest in a drilling and spacing unit, you can cause all of the other owners in that unit, both working interest owners and revenue interest owners, to participate in a well. You can force a well in that unit. In Texas, you still can't do that. So I'm not sure that there's any differential politically enforced, which would cause the development of reserves in Texas to be more aggressive than the development of reserves in Oklahoma. In fact, quite the contrary.
Mike?
And all I would say is I would agree with George here. I'm not familiar with your National Geographic article, so I apologize. But the system is the same. And what the circumstances that George is describing that's occurred in some states versus others is that minerals have been sold and separated from the landowner, the surface owner. And the unintended consequence that you're highlighting is true. It's so much easier for me to lay pipeline on someone's property when they own the minerals as well. So the conversation is very different because they're aligned in our interests. They want to see me there. They recognize they're going to participate. And I think your point that you're making is when that is separated, for whatever reason, if it's because the minerals were sold in the 1920s and this person bought it without minerals, it does create a circumstance that makes the challenge of putting surface equipment on that property more difficult. I think the important part, though, is to recognize that the industry works very well with surface owners as well as mineral owners to ensure that we're doing the right thing on their property. We actually want to have a respectful relationship with every landowner that we have, and we try our best to compensate them accordingly. It is an arm's length negotiation. Frankly, I feel like they're in the driver's seat more often than I am when it comes to negotiating, and it is a process that I believe that is free market, and I believe it's healthy. You do from time to time get anecdotal stories where ill will has been done. In some states, we have the ability to condemn when we find our situation impossible. But we generally, as an industry, do not want to do that. We want to work with the landowners and create a commercial relationship that's best for all parties.
I have a question about, you've talked a little bit about natural gas liquids, but I believe it deserves a little more time and effort. There was a big decrease in the natural gas liquids prices this last year. Was that due to pipelines or other type of restrictions?
Yeah, thanks. I'll take that. Mike or somebody else may want to chime in as well. But really, it's a matter of oversupply against the markets. And so if you think about how long it takes to drill a well, get a processing plant in place, get the pipelines in place, let's say that's 2.5, 3 years from the time you start. The market signals to the petrochemical complex, however, and the permitting time that it takes to build out a major petrochemical complex is more around 4 or 5 years. And so you have a big step differential between the time that the liquids get produced and the time that the ethylene cracking or whatever olefinic product that you're trying to make, that gets built. And so really what we have right now is a big oversupply because we saw a very large margin. This time last year, we were seeing ethane margins in the 40 to 45 cent a gallon margin, so huge margin back to the producers and to the processors. Today, that number is about a minus 5 cents. So there's a lot of ethane starting to get knocked out of the market that's not having to be produced, particularly in areas like the Rockies and places like that where your transport costs into the market or further. So the good news is our market's working very well. There was a very strong price signal. People went after it, put all the infrastructure in, and supplied that. Today now, we have a lag waiting on the petrochemical complexes to catch up to be able to absorb that market. And hopefully, we'll still have the productive capabilities for those natural gas liquids when those petrochemical crackers start up, or we'll see another huge swing in volatility in the market.
You also have a lack of export facilities as well. Mm-hmm. So some products you can export,
right,
but you have limited export capacity.
And my only thing I would add is, bottom line is you're seeing the market at work. You actually saw a shift of the rig activity from dry gas to liquid-rich wells. That brought on the incremental NGL supply, which sent the signal to the demand, the petrochemicals, that now they're in the process of recognizing that they've got ample supply to build expansion capacity, which, by the way, they have very robust economics to do so. And so you're going to see this thing ebb and flow, but the reality of it is this NGL supply story is another source of economic stimulus. It's another source of further jobs. It's a good news story. There will be periods of time where you're in ethane rejection because the price isn't right, or we might have trouble placing the isobutane because there's not alkylation equipment in the refineries, or you might have an inability to get natural gasoline to Canada to be used as diluent because the pipeline's not built in time. But all of these things work its way out over time, and we just have to deal with some of this volatility.
I think we have time for one more question before we break for lunch.
George, I've got my stockbroker on speed dial. And if it's not horizontal drilling and hydrofracking, my God, what is it?
Well, as you recall, I said in my teaser that it was really not hydraulic fracturing, and it was not horizontal drilling that caused the technological change that allowed U.S. gas initially and oil subsequently to deliver in much higher economic quantities. The answer to that teaser, and it's not perhaps very refreshing to you all because it's too fine-tuned, is that we've had hydraulic fracturing since 1947 or 8 when Amoco developed it. And there have not been drastic changes. There have been certainly been fluid changes and horsepower changes and so forth. But in and of itself, that would not have changed the entire productivity of oil and gas wells in the United States. Similarly, with horizontal drilling, which has been around for at least 30 years, a number of wells have been drilled, the technologies have been improved somewhat, but that's not the overriding technological change. I'd say the secondary technological change that enabled the great increase in shale production and tight reservoir production is, first of all the drilling technique improvements, which is kind of surprising. After all of these years in the industry, with the basic style of drilling being the same, we make some improvements in bits and in pressure on the bit and top drives and so forth, which allow wells to be drilled in 8 days that were previously drilled in 30 days, and that has been material. But far more important, and this is fairly subtle if you don't think about it or you're not involved in the industry, it is the ability in that horizontal hole to thoroughly segregate each of the segments that you wish to individually treat. Because in the past, in horizontal drilling and fracture treating, you drilled your horizontal hole, you put pipe in the hole, no cement around it, no packers around it. You shoved some hydraulic fracture treatment into it and hoped it went to the right place, with the theory being that it went to the most permeable spot in the reservoir. Well, you typically got 1 or 2 of your segments of the hole treated. Now you drill into 12 to 48, I guess, individual segments every 250 feet or so. You have the ability to segregate each of those segments with either cement or a packer and treat each one separately, and in effect make 12 to 48 new wellbores, equivalent to a vertical wellbore, in one wellbore. And in fact, the beauty and glory of horizontal drilling is nothing more, a little bit over-exaggerated, than the ability to drill at 3 times the cost 12 to 48 wells in the same wellbore.
Right.
Does that seem reasonable to those of you who are involved in that part of the business? And the other thing that is a little bit out of line in the lay discussion of hydraulic fracturing, especially in those areas who have no experience with it, in Pennsylvania, New York, and so forth, there have been 4 attacks on hydraulic fracturing. One is subsurface communication with freshwater supplies. That's the one that scares people the most, I guess. Surface disposition of the recovered frack water and with the chemicals it contains, some of which are poisonous chemicals. The use of just the raw use of massive quantities of water, which is a scarce commodity, in an area where that water is needed for human consumption. And then more recently, earthquakes, I guess, and maybe there's a 5th item. But interestingly enough, with virtually all of those concerns, the issue derives from drilling the hole in the first place, not from the fracture treatment. In other words, if you drill a hole into the ground such that it intersects a freshwater supply at shallow and a brackish water supply at deep, And if you do not have an excellent cement job separating those two formations around the pipe, then you can have communication. And it has happened in hundreds or perhaps thousands of cases around the country. It's generally fixed, but it's happened. Fracturing is very unlikely to, it's possible. There's never really been a good proved case. There have been a couple that have thought to be proved, but it's very unlikely to communicate the good water with the bad water. So if we have a concern about this new technique, it ought to be about drilling wells in the first place and using procedures that assure that the fresh water and the brackish water are kept separate. As far as surface disposition, we've done a lot better job of that. We're not dumping it in creeks anymore. In many cases, maybe most cases now, we're recycling the water and removing the chemicals and then dumping it or reusing it in another fracture treatment. The massive quantities of water is helped to the degree that you recycle water. You don't have to use quite as much. And ironically, the one that sounds farthest fetched, the earthquake concern, is probably the closest to being a real concern. Not a real concern in the sense of very great damage to the body politic or the general public, but there is some pretty good evidence that injection of water, whether after a frac or just a normal water well, can in fact lubricate natural fault movement and cause a premature shifting of that fault, cause a premature small frac, a small earthquake. You could make the argument that reducing the pressure by creating a premature small earthquake is better than letting it develop into a larger earthquake. But there is some evidence of that, and where it has occurred, states have denied additional water injection or any water injection in the area, and it appears that the incidence of earthquakes in that area, small earthquakes in that area, has declined. So it's only of interest here to me because you hear so much in the press that is so ill-informed about this subject, and I think there is a reasoned, rational answer, and I hope that was one piece of it that you can take away with you.
Thanks, George.
What was the new technology, though? I can't let you off, George. I don't know if he's got his speed dial, but I've got mine. So what's the next technology that's going to make a difference?
I wasn't projecting. And the throwaway at the end that says the engineers will ultimately be, well, it'll be some combination. I think in order to undercut the power of the OPEC nations to manipulate our foreign policy and to manipulate our economy, we do have to have a reduction in the burning of liquid hydrocarbons. So the technologies I would be looking toward in the near term, certainly CNG that everybody's been talking about, and Jim Woolsey talked about methanol, are significant. I think, from what I know as a political scientist, not an engineer, it appears that electric cars are more efficient than any kind of internal combustion engine, even though it is very efficient to generate the electricity in the first place from the same hydrocarbons. So I think what will be really important is the conservation that has occurred in Europe, Japan, and the United States, and a conversion, very gradual over time, to cars which either have more efficient internal combustion engines, we're going up to 52.5 if we can get there on the CAFE standards, coupled with adoption of CNG cars for fleets, LNG trucks for long-haul trucks, and electric cars or hybrid electric cars with adequate range for the general populace. If you put all that together, you don't really need to cut the demand for fuel from 90 million barrels a day to 50 million barrels a day to undercut OPEC's power. But what you need to do is create enough combination of increased production in the U.S. and other places and reduced demand in the U.S. and other places to cause a growing gap between supply and demand in the world. If you have a growing gap instead of a level or declining gap, you're going to undermine the cartel. And I think we're well on the way to getting that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Well,
said.
thank you, George. I know we've kept you guys a little bit past lunch, but about to be served. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
These are very tough issues. One last kind of general point. And I love your question, though. A piece of advice I would give all young people, and frankly us, but the more people disagree with you, the most respectful thing you can do is listen and engage them. I do that with all the environmental groups, Sierra Club, Union of Concerned Scientists, you name it, I bring them all in, doing it here in another 2 months. And I engage them throughout the year. But we get them all in a room and we just kind of have it out. Listen first. There are always points of intersection that will serve both your interests. I guarantee you that if you can find your kind of common approaches, if you can humanize the issues, you can make progress.
Yeah, I think if you took a pipeline, just take a picture of our pipeline, which goes from the Mexican border up to the Canadian border and everywhere in between. You're right. It takes a lot of people to build the pipeline. It doesn't take as many to run it. It takes a lot of people to build a house. It doesn't take as many people to run it. It takes a lot of people to build, major buildings, the Devon building here. But, you haven't got all those people in there forever. However, along a pipeline, there are compression stations from Warren, Missouri, every small town, and I guarantee you, if you kind of point it out, those jobs A, never go overseas. You cannot run a pipeline from China. And B, those are usually the best jobs in those communities. And I find when I've done that with people, after listening to their view, it's, well, you know what? I've got a cousin that lives in Warren, Missouri, or I've got X, Y, and Z. And people haven't done that. And I think if you can, to your point, humanize it where we are and where those pipelines or electric assets or E&P assets, yeah, I think that's important. I think as an industry, we got to do a better job because we do move people around as we build things. And it does not go over well when we send a bunch of trucks up from Oklahoma to Pennsylvania and the local folks see Oklahoma license plates. No better than it would be if it's Ohio license plates in here in Oklahoma. So that's the kind of stuff we got to do better, as in being sensitive to what's going on in those communities.
Another question from the audience? To the left.
Pardon? Okay. Thank you to each of you. I think all of you have enlightened us greatly. I'm with a company here in Oklahoma City that has worked with a number of you. But I just want to say that the one thing I think that's been most valuable about this shale gale that we've got is the ability that we've had finally to be trusted partners. And heretofore, we've not really been in a position to really understand who our customers were. We would sell into the pipeline, we'd sell to a marketer, but frankly, we couldn't enter into long-term contracts like we're able to now. We couldn't approach OEMs about natural gas-fueled vehicles because, frankly, we didn't know that we would be able to consistently provide them with a fuel that they could depend on. I think the other thing, so I just want to thank all of you for that. As we've gotten more involved with utilities like yours, Tom, and as we've gotten involved with major industrials, we understand who their customers are. We understand how to work with them. We understand how to talk with them about IDCs and why that's important for them too. The other thing that I would just say is that our industry has not done a very good job at reaching out in those communities in which we're engaged. We've had the attitude that all of the places that we drill are Odessa. The fact is that in these new places where we're drilling, people have high expectations. And if we don't come to those places with people representing our companies who are familiar with those areas, who are folks that grew up in there, in those communities, and who have a sense of unanimity, of unity with those people, they are not going to see us as people that are there for the long term. So thanks for the lessons that you've given to all of us. Appreciate it.
Another question down here.
First of all, thank you again for coming here and having the roundtable. My question was, I completely agree with this. reaching out, articulating this jobs message to people. As someone who's about to get a job in the financial services industry, I'm going to do a much better job of trying to convince people that we're on their side. But at the same time, that takes time, and it's kind of like even with election cycles, they're a couple of years. And so, like in the short term, do you really have any hope that there's like a cohesive policy like that we can formulate? I mean, it just seems really, really divisive right now.
It is. Look, it's like trying to keep the waves off the beach sometime. You just got to be relentless in kind of individual actions, in industry actions. I met with a bunch of the natural gas guys through ANGA when we had our EEI meeting in Phoenix. It was funny. At one time, the gas guys were throwing bombs at the coal guys, and maybe you weren't, but some people were. And what we've got to understand is there is a rational portfolio of energy that we can all be for. We've got to figure out how to play offense as an energy complex and really do what's right for America. And we've just got to be relentless about it. And the more we work together, the more we understand each other's kind of value proposition. Everything's a function of risk and return. And how do we optimize it among all of us? That's how we're going to have to drive this message home. I swear the right message is about jobs and the economy. That's the way to approach this issue.
So Tom, let me pick up on your point there. So between the hard work of crafting a strategy and the really hard work of executing a strategy, there lies something in the middle, which is not so easy itself, which is articulating it well and communicating what the message is. The energy sector, the value chain is pretty broad. There's a lot of intersection points between you and the folks that are sitting on either side of you. Rather than think about it from a vertical industry segment perspective, what's it going to take to be able to get all of the industries together, to be able to articulate a better message that's common to all of them?
Well, so first of all, I think we've got to take the responsibility ourselves, and I think we've started doing that. But I think EEI even, our industry is always challenged because there's the dereg guys and the integrated regulated guys. I'm an integrated regulated guy. But I think we all got to understand, look, I want all you gas guys to be as successful as you can be. I want clean, safe, reliable, affordable, no matter what form the energy stock is, right? So what we've got to do as leaders of the enterprise is work together and find the common messages and find the pressure points in government to be the most effective we can. We've got to take responsibility ourselves.
And it's not an us or them. I mean, the word collaboration isn't used enough, right? So we've got to let's face it, to your question about where's the hope, well, my hope is that I think we can find enough short-term wins for the politicians. Because let's face it, the political structure in this country, and it's the best in the world, is short-term, right? Unless you think between elections is long-term. The structure for companies is long-term. Shell just put out its 100-year plan on energy. You should get it. It just came out last week. Very interesting in different scenarios. Some that'll be wrong, some that'll be right. And so there's got to be some collaboration, some nexus between that point of short-term political interests and the long-term economic interest. And that's where the leadership, both politically and business, has got to find a way to come together with the vast majority of the public, common ground in that public. Because the rational middle is there. Yeah. And that's our challenge, to find the short-term win for politicians and yet make sure we're looking after the long-term interest of our shareholders.
And I think the converse is obvious. You just don't let it happen. So you must take responsibility for trying to drive the right answer.
We'll go back to the audience, see if there's some questions we haven't picked up.
I'm not in the energy industry. I'm just an interested party. And I've learned an awful lot here today that I didn't know before, and I thank you for that. But I'm afraid I have to ask kind of a hard question. Image of the energy industry. Okay, I get with the jobs, everybody knows tons of jobs, and that we all use electricity, and that we have to have a comprehensive energy policy because it's central to our economy, the U.S. economy. But you have image problems, and one of them is when you do have a big spill, with all of your technology and all your innovation, how come you can't have the technology and innovation to clean that up pretty quickly? And that's probably not a question you wanted to hear, but that's my question.
I'll address that one. If you probably didn't know with your question, but Anadarko owned 25% of the Macondo well that blew out that BP was the operator on. As an industry that operates in the deep water, we should have been better at that moment in time with response. Today we are. That's not to make an excuse for why we weren't, but as an industry in 2010, on April 19th, we were not prepared to respond appropriately. Since that time, I think our industry's taken great steps in order, if we were to have a catastrophe of that sort again, to be able to be much more responsive. I think a lot of lessons, unfortunately, were learned from Macondo. I think we wouldn't see a well go that long in terms of being able to discharge the hydrocarbon. Simply because I think one of the lessons learned is there's things that you're just going to have to do in the first 24 or 48 hours if you have something like that was not contemplated, but actually was considered, but was pushed aside because it might cause more flow in that 24 or 48 hour period than was acceptable both to the operator and the regulators. So there was a combination of a lot of people doing a lot of things as best they could, but dealing in the vacuum of an unusual situation. So I think response in terms of things like Macondo, I'm very comfortable to say I think our industry is much better today to respond to that. A lot of the spills that you read about onshore associated with, I'll call it discharge into pits that find their way into groundwater, those are very isolated. And typically, the environmental health and safety component of an E&P company is very quick to get in and to discharge any problems that are associated with it. And in each state, I think the regulators come in and do a very good job of making sure that whatever occurred, in fact, was cleaned up appropriately. We are a business, though, that can never lean on the fact that we're good enough. We have to keep getting better. And I hope that answers your question.
Let me begin to wrap this up a little bit and ask each of our panelists just to maybe make some closing comments here. Jeff, we'll start with you, but what haven't we talked about today? What haven't we touched on that you think is important to leave as a message, for this group around where we take the nation from an energy perspective, whether it's policy, strategy, or just a set of rules of the road?
I just say for those of us that spend a lot of time in Washington on some of these policy issues, to address the last question, the time horizon is so much longer than we're used to as private sector people and commercial decision makers. In D.C., it's a success for a senator to get something done in 2 terms of 12 years. For us, we've all lost our jobs by then, and it doesn't count. So I think our own impatience is sometimes not the right barometer to measure this by, and I think we are making headway. It always lags. I think all the education that these guys are doing will have impact. It just takes an incredible amount of time. And again, I think in our industry, we couldn't have been more vilified over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And, I'm sure we'll sit here in 5 years and, that'll be a lot better. I hope it is. But so I think patience, unfortunately, is going to be a big part of all of what we do, because these guys are committing billions of dollars of capital for 50 years, sometimes constructing for 6 to 10, and the environment around them is by definition going to be dramatically different than they thought it was when they started.
We didn't talk, it came up earlier about geologists, and I will just want to point out that we hire a lot of geologists every year.
You need them. Trolling for resumes.
They actually are geologists that work in the petroleum sector. They're not out doing other things in the broadly defined use of geology. For an exploration company, we actually start with the geology, not the geophysics. And I know a lot of companies start with the geophysics and then have the geology confirmed. We kind of come at it the old way. And I think as an industry, it's hard to find oil and gas. And even after you find it, it's harder to produce it and commercially do it in a way where you get a good rate of return. As an industry, we've typically not been the best at using capital efficiently. A lot of that has to do with a comment I made earlier. We start down the process of allocating capital. The costs are not defined. The revenue that we're going to get is not defined because we're not sure what the hydrocarbon environment is going to be for the revenue stream. So it makes for a different and difficult equation. But geology and engineer, both defined as geologists and engineers, are critically important to our success and our future. And being able to combine that into a business framework is going to be extremely important that we get right. Again, it's one of those skills that we have that's a great technique and a great desire for other countries to import. The skills that are being created at this school for the students here, I think you will find as you work internationally, you are a valued resource to a country that sees your education and what you know to be incredible and something they want more of.
Yeah, I just hit just 2 quick points. So value is a function of risk and return. And when we think about uncertainty and kind of all the risk that's wound up in that, certainty is a myth. There's no way. So you're always making kind of decisions with a great degree of uncertainty. So, you know, I think the key is when Jeff was talking about, you know, the market doesn't value uncertainty very well. Well, you know what? As a business leader, you're going to have to figure it out and be able to articulate very clearly to the people you serve first, your customers. That's where you should start. But also everybody you work with, your industry peers, everything else, why you're doing, what you're doing, how you bring value to their lives. That is so key. The other point I'll just make, we didn't touch a lot on it, but it's this highfalutin notion of restoring America's financial integrity. You know, that is an obligation, not an option of mine, but it is of yours as well. When we talk about we're the people that elect these people, we've got to hold each other and them accountable. We've got to be relentless in our messaging about restoring America to where it should be. And we have a wonderful opportunity with the energy sector, frankly, to be able to position ourselves like nobody's business and to get out of this logjam we're in. So, you know, let's play offense with that and let's share that accountability together.
2 points I would have been, with some discussion of it earlier. The first one is the peace dividend issue, and I think it has direct correlation to energy being in North America. We have fought, you know, you pick your number, 3, 4, 5 wars in the last 20 years, largely because of energy, despite what might have been said that they were 4. And there is a real dividend to, and you know, tell me what the cost of a life is. And tell me what the cost of guns versus butter is. You know, this discussion, which goes very much to the issue of the financial stability of the country. And I'm not sure we gave that enough attention. The second point is one just being, yeah, a level of humility. You know, I'm not sure that we should be sitting here trying to solve the problems for the next 50 years. You all are smart. My kids are smart. And let's solve the problems for the next 10 or 15 years, because each generation is going to bring massive changes. It's not that we shouldn't think about these issues. Each generation is going to build new technology, create new technology, and most people coming out of college today know more when they leave college than their grandparents knew their entire life. And so we should be somewhat humble in terms of what we can actually do in the short period of time that we're here, and also give the opportunity and just keep the responsibility that the next generation will have a problem to solve their own problems as well.
Since this was sponsored by a business school, we haven't talked much about the business side of this. So let me just end on this note that, you know, everyone knows the expression that democracy, our democracy, but democracy in general is a very messy and actually very unsatisfactory governance system. But the only point, of course, is that everything else that we've ever tried is worse. So democracy is a marvelous thing. I would say, analogously, industry, businesses are messy, challenging. Sometimes they don't do what we like. They don't always behave in their own self-interest or their broader interests. I mean, to your point, Macondo, I mean, I have friends who I know in the industry were lobbying to have certain prepositioning of assets to anticipate a spill like that. They were not listened to. That's normal. This is not because somebody was evil. The real question about how you achieve a great economy like America has, and how we have adequate energy supply, which is, as I said earlier, not a nice to have. It is what makes humanity possible. Is what's your choice? Government will figure out how to do it and will run everything, or the private sector does it. So the most valuable thing that America has to offer is not its innovation in technology. I believe it's extraordinarily valuable. Untouched in the world, nobody's close. Second place is so far behind, it's breathtaking in every field, in energy, in tech, in transportation, just broadly speaking. But what we have that's best, that's phenomenal, is our free market business system. And it has an extraordinary moral and social value. Yes, there are bad apples, and the industry itself tries to weed them out, and government regulates it. But there's nothing like it. I mean, when I visit companies, I've visited maybe 1,000 now. I visit hundreds of companies, small and large, but mostly small in the last 10 years. And what I find the most exciting is the vibrancy of our business community, of small and large businesses in America. When you go into business, and the business of business is one of the most exciting things you can do, and one of the most exciting times, frankly, in the history of the country. There's a lot of opportunity. It's not a terrible future. The worst thing people can do is to think that the future is terrible, because the future is what you make it. I can guarantee you every forecast will have mostly things that are mostly wrong, but what would be wrong about the most is that the future won't be good, it won't be nice. It'll be what you create it, and it will be created largely by businesses. And if you're in business school, going into business, you're performing not only something that's fun, it's interesting, but of extraordinary value to the country and to the world. American businesses have transformed the world in ways that no other businesses have ever in humanity. The British Empire came the closest, right? But they were an empire. They wanted to stay when they went. What empire has ever gone places and wants to get out, except when they're invited in to help people in business? So it's a marvelous profession to pursue. I wish I had gone to B school after my physics degree, because it took me a long, long time to figure out how business worked after that. So it's a really good thing to be doing, and I admire all of you that are pursuing that career.
Let me invite our chairman, Bruce, back up. I think he's got some quick closing comments. But for those that are still with us, thanks very much for attending. We hope you found this a valuable day. You got some good takeaways, whether you're from the industry or whether you're in school here and still have a career in front of you. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a great effort this afternoon.
Just want to say a few quick words before we close and shut it down today. First, thanks to all the people that made this vision of ours in our first year of existence as this institute happen. A lot of hard work went, and a lot of persistence and courage, and went into believing that we could actually do this. And for Tom and others that helped us get our speakers here today, in spite of some of the challenges, I thank you. It was an incredible group of people, very broad base of experience and perspective on things. And yet what I heard today, among other things, was a very solid thread of commonality in the approach, in spite of their backgrounds and their businesses that they represent and so forth. I think everyone was speaking as an American with America's interests at heart. All of us are parents and grandparents. For us, we think about our kids and our grandkids. That's what drives us. So we are talking about a system in this country that is unique in the world. And I've lived overseas, I've worked overseas, and I promise you, this is unique. We have the ability to unleash creativity, imagination, and great value creation. We've got challenges in front of us, but I've lived in other places where their challenges are far worse. I'm glad I'm not a European, because their problems are more difficult than ours are. We need to grab it. There's a sense of urgency, I believe, and it's all about the economy, and I certainly agree with that. But we need to grab hold of this business about the economy, economic growth and job creation, and build around it, because energy is the driver of that. And if we can make that connection, and sell it to every stakeholder in the game, particularly the consumers and everybody who's a part of our consumer civilization, we'll have it made, because believe me, the government will come along. And as my friend Bob reminded me, most people in government have two objectives. One is to get elected, and one is to get reelected. And we make them look good by doing the right things. And in my view, instead of looking for things coming down to us and pontificated from above because they suddenly get it, maybe it's a broad, cohesive effort from this broad sector of industry to do the right things, to take the high moral ground, and to raise all ships by doing those right things and demonstrating that this can actually happen and communicating it. So I think that's our challenge as we, one of the things we're going to do as an institute is to put out a white paper. It'll be out in about a month's time. It'll be posted on our website. We want you guys to, weigh in into some of the conclusions and recommendations from this thing. But I can assure you that this institute, as new as it is, and the fact that it comes from an academic setting with academians involved, it's going to be a neutral. We're about, it's nonpartisan, non-special interest, but it's going to be right on message with what you guys were talking about. We will be a voice in the choir, and I hope we're a successful voice in the choir to help this happen. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your time with us. One more thing I want to say about the Institute. It was mentioned this morning in the Dean's opening comments. We've got this new executive MBA program that focuses on energy. For you that represent companies or know people who may be interested, I think this is an extraordinary opportunity. If you can imagine the opportunity to take an engineer, geologist, geophysicist, or anybody else who hasn't been classically trained in business principles and give them a very concise training that this will provide, focused on energy, it's a real extraordinary opportunity. If you want to know more about it, there's a table set up outside where you can get more information about it. Pass it along to your colleagues and other people who may have employees that should be interested, should know about this. Again, thank you for your audience and for your attention, and the students for your questions. I hope you feel encouraged by the future that you see that you're going to grow up in. And you guys are part of the solution. You're a big part of the solution. A lot of us are old fogies, and we're in the fourth quarter. So you guys are still in the first. So pour it on. That's all I say. So thank you to all of the people with OU who helped support us to get this done. And again, safe travels on the way home. Thanks.